Immediately to my left is Matt Rand. He's director of the Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy of the Pew Charitable Trusts. To his left, Brune Poirson is France's Secretary of State to the Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition. And finally, on the far left is Peter Thompson. He's the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. You're all used to all-star panels here at Davos, and this is no exception. So, I'd like to ask Matt to begin to explain a little more about what we're discussing, why this is important, and why the high seas are so essential to the well-being of the planet and to humanity. Matt.
Thanks, Erik. Well, maybe just take a step back. Erik painted a really dire picture, which is absolutely true. I am very optimistic, though. I think we have an incredible opportunity in front of us. We have the first time ever, we actually have the knowledge to actually make these informed decisions to protect our planet, and that goes for the high seas as well. Not only do we have the knowledge, Erik pointed out in the opening there that we actually have a very short window, a very important window of 2 years to develop a treaty for the high seas, the area that's 50% of the planet for conservation. So it could not come at a better time. I'm pinch hitting a little bit for the scientist that was going to be here to talk a little bit about actually why we care about this area that most people don't even fathom in their daily lives.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the area where blue whales migrate across the ocean, tiger sharks, thresher sharks, manta rays. It is sometimes talked about as the Serengeti of the ocean. These are incredible places out in the ocean. They are not just barren deserts. They interconnect the coastal waters with ecosystems that are, open ocean and pelagic. They are truly an incredible, biologically significant place on this planet. And they are where much of the phytoplankton that actually generates oxygen for the planet. So these are incredible, it is an incredible ecosystem that is right now, as Mark mentioned, not being sustainably managed or protected in any sort of substantial way. And we have an opportunity, a 2-year window, to actually get a treaty in place to help conserve 50% of the planet.
Could you talk a little bit, Matt, about 3 of the things that I mentioned, just to give people a little more detail? Overfishing, the plastic problem, and deep-sea mining?
Sure. Overfishing, it's very clear. We've actually we've gotten to the point of peak fisheries. We're on decline of global fishery catches. We do have management bodies that are it's kind of a broken management system attempting to manage sustainably predominantly tuna populations. Unfortunately, there's lots of other fish species that are dependent on the open ocean, but we do have a global problem when it comes to overfishing, and we don't have a governance system that covers all the ecosystems and all the fisheries. The plastics, I think it was brought up earlier this morning, we're getting an incredible reaction. Thank you, it was glass. An incredible reaction to plastics, and someone mentioned, one of the panelists earlier mentioned that it's a gateway drug into people actually caring about ocean conservation. I think that's absolutely correct. It's visible. It's something that we can see. The projections are very concerning. We're talking about in a very short time frame, decades, that we will have more plastic in the ocean than biomass of fish. So we absolutely have to address that quickly. And your last...
Deep sea mining.
Deep sea mining is an emerging industry. They're developing a mining code now. There's certainly a lot of interest, and companies are already putting claims in for the bottom habitat so that they can extract minerals. The potential for damage, mining industry is not known as a benign industry. So the potential for extreme environmental degradation is certainly there.
Brune, if you wouldn't mind picking it up from there, could you help us understand why this is important to France? This is part of your portfolio. Why this is important? What is the French government doing?
So it's partly part of my portfolio. Things are never simple in government, especially in France. But France has the second largest maritime area in the world. We have 11 million square kilometers of maritime territory, as we call it in France. And so that gives us a special responsibility, and we need to rise up to the challenge. So we do two things. First, we support international diplomatic initiatives, especially negotiations around the high seas and BBNG. And two, we try and find concrete solutions to tackling issues such as plastic pollution of the oceans. Specifically, we try and do that by identifying whether there are potentially viable business models that could be developed. And we try and to support biodiversity preservation, mostly.
Now, give us some perspective. Why is it, do you think, that certain countries like France see this as an important issue and are actually doing something about it, and others aren't? Now, I can understand why some countries that might be landlocked have slightly less of an intrinsic interest in the health of the high seas, but there doesn't seem to be anything close to unanimity on this issue. If you could discuss that, talk to us perhaps about, if you like, some of the countries that you think share the same point of view that France has, and as well, if you like, some of the countries that you think ought to be called out for a lack of action, willful ignorance, or something beyond that, perhaps.
Well, given that I'm a member of the government, I can't do shaming publicly.
Peter's going to do that for us.
Yes, so I'm not going to do that myself, although it could be tempting. But I think it's partly an issue of, the high seas is something, by definition, it's really hard to see, to grasp, to identify, and so to relate to. So I think part of it is perhaps one of the reasons why the high seas has never, and even the ocean in general, sometimes it's difficult for some countries to really take a leadership position on that. And I think it's also because, or at least I'm talking about, the EU, and it's certainly the case in France, the issue is of the ocean is not treated as, as a global either opportunity or problem, but something to take care of, because it's fragmented. It's the ocean. In France, I think about 10 ministries could potentially look after that. See, I started saying, well, it's me, but it's not really me. And so it means, it's my ministry, but it's not really my ministry. So it means basically that no one is taking ownership and no one is really willing to step up and take a responsibility and fight for the ocean. We are changing that, and President Macron has decided to make it a really high priority of our international diplomatic, but also economic agenda. As I said, we want to find concrete solutions to help protect the oceans. And so that's why it's a centerpiece of the One Planet Summit, which was launched by President Macron when President Trump decided to leave the Paris Agreement. So we are making it a priority. Now the issue is the way our ministries are organized is not right to really be as efficient as we could be.
As I understand it, Prime Minister Trudeau lived up to a commitment to make the oceans an issue for the G7.
Yes.
When Canada had the G7 leadership, that baton is being passed to France. And will France make it a signature issue for the G7? And if so, how do you get the countries that refuse to sign onto the Ocean Charter, the United States and Japan, on board this time around?
So you're not letting me go. So I should have mentioned, so you're right, I should have mentioned that France is going to be hosting the G7 this year. And for us, clearly, so I mentioned the One Planet Summit. Why? Because we see the One Planet Summit as an opportunity to actually deliver concrete action, concrete projects, concrete solutions in favor of the environment. And as I said, we have the One Planet Summit is centered on 3 things: the ocean, biodiversity, and climate or energy. And so we want to make the One Planet Summit as a key part of the G7, even part of the official agenda, so that we have concrete projects that come out of the G7. Because we want to go one step further. A lot of the G7 initiatives have been great, but they lead to a communiqué or they lead to a nice document that hopefully some journalists read, but never, I don't know any French citizens who has ever read a communiqué that has come out of the G7. So we want to go one step further and really make it concrete. And yes, the ocean is going to be a key part of it. And sometimes through diplomatic initiatives, you don't always reach what we should be reaching or what we should reach. So that's also why we want to work with civil society organizations and companies, but with real ambition as a way of circumventing some of the diplomatic initiatives that don't move fast enough, basically. So we need your help. And I'm going to call on or ask for some of your help.
So, Peter, on the subject of shaming, who's helping and who's hurting here on a national level?
Okay, big question. Look, first of all, can I just start my remarks by saying that I don't think we have to make a choice between optimism and pessimism. And apologies to you, Matt, because there's so much pessimism around at the moment, and then you're forced into saying, I'm an optimist. I don't believe in you. You don't have to make that choice. What we are, as people who are involved in government and governance, is pragmatists. We have to be pragmatic about the challenges that are facing us now. And that's the way it's always been. So what have we got in front of us in terms of ocean governance, I think is where you're getting at. And, which countries involved was your specific question. Well, if you take the law of the sea, which has been around for decades, so let's not blame the present administration. And my country, Fiji, was the first to sign the law of the sea, I'm happy to say. But there are a few countries which have yet to sign it. Only a very few, Venezuela and the United States, for example, that haven't signed it yet. But as with the Paris Climate Agreement, if a certain administration in Washington says, oh, we're not part of this, what I have found is that, in fact, America is with it, of course. The philanthropies, the cities, the states, everybody is observing the Paris Climate Agreement in terms of trying to get the changes we need. Same thing goes for the law of the sea. United States may not have signed it, but if you go to Jamaica, where the International Seabed Authority is that decides on what happens on the seabed, you'll find that Americans are there in strength. I mean, Lockheed Martin is there every year in Jamaica at the annual meeting. So America is engaged in all these things. Now, that leads me to the question of what is happening in the high seas. It's been described as this Wild West and all the rest. Not entirely true. We've got RFMOs, regional fisheries management organizations, which basically cover the fisheries side pretty fully around the world. They're not doing, some of them are not doing a great job, some of them are. But without those, we would have total chaos in terms of fisheries. So the RFMOs are doing their job. Now, when it comes to the law which is underway, and excuse the acronym, but at the UN they've got the BBNJ conference underway, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions. This is going to result in law by 2020, that's next year, for the water column of the high seas. What's the treatment of the genetic properties of that, who owns it, etc. All that is going to be covered under the law which will come out of this BBNJ conference next year. That's not 100% guaranteed, but my experience is that when a UN conference gets underway, it always results, if it sets out to get some law, it always results in law. It doesn't necessarily mean good law, but it will result in law, and that will be subsumed into into UNCLOS, the law of the sea. So that is the water column. Now, at the same time, people must be aware of this. At the same time that law for the water column is being devised and will come into being next year, There is law, which again has been, all the countries of the world have been involved in it down Jamaica, for the seabed, for the mining of the seabed. What we have for the seabed at the moment, and remember, this is actually the best governed part of the planet, the seabed. We have, every country goes every year to Jamaica to oversee that. Now, it happens to be best governed because it's most difficult place
Furthest
to get
away,
to.
yes.
Right? But at the moment, you can get an exploration license to go down and see what's there, but you can only explore. You cannot exploit. But the exploitation regulations are being finalized now. So expect by next year that there will be a mining code in place for the seabed where you or I can go and apply to go and mine the seabed. So you will have law for the seabed and you'll have law for the water column by probably the end of next year. And it's very important that everybody understands that that law is in its final stages of being drawn up. And this is the last chance, if you're interested in the ecological side, of making sure that the bar is set very high.
Erik, just wanted to step in here too. Peter did a great job of laying out the big picture here, but what we're talking about is, he's absolutely right. We have regional fishery management organizations, lots of other fragmented ways in which we're trying to govern the high seas, but we do not have a conservation protocol mandate for the high seas, and that is what is being developed. So the science indicates that we need to buffer extraction on this planet generally. And scientists have indicated that we need at least 30% of the ocean protected. Depending
This
on,
is where your expertise comes
this
from.
is my job. Depending on whose database you're looking at, we have either 4% or 7% of the world's oceans protected. So we have a long way to go to reach that 30%. And the only way that it's going to be viable to do that is to actually get areas on the high seas protected. They are a buffer for the fishing that has been taking place, overfishing that's been taking place, helping for climate resilience. And so that is why it is so essential that in the next 2 years, we get a strong governing mandate for the high seas so that we can actually put these buffers in the ocean, these protected areas in the ocean.
Can I just ask a practical question on that front? And I wouldn't claim to be an expert, but again, I do like to do a little fishing and I know a few things about fish. Does that really work? Wouldn't these buffer zones have to be enormous? Because all the pelagic species move, right? They don't stay in one place. Just look at the tracking sensors that are put on sharks or occasionally on cetaceans. You see how, the vast distances that they travel. So the moment they exit the protected area, they become fair game again.
Yes, they actually do work. Depends on where they are, how they're placed, and how they're developed. The scientists that would have been here, Doug McCulley, would have talked about all the tagging that they've done around oceanic sharks. And it's very clear that these areas, they are massive areas in size, and some of them are the size of Texas,
right,
and larger. And those areas are capable of protecting pelagic ecosystems, manta rays, sharks, whales, important feeding areas. Certainly more science is needed to show the benefits of these areas for pelagic creatures. The whole concept of large ecosystem scale protected areas in the ocean is really only 10 years old. So the science is not quite caught up to that. But it's what we do know is that they are absolutely important to help keep these ecosystems intact.
Definitely.
Brune, were you going to jump in?
Well, I was just going to say, so as the two of you rightly mentioned, we have 2 years, basically, a bit less perhaps, to achieve, significant piece of legislation. And so I was just going to jump in and say, in France, we are very much aware of the next 2 years are absolutely critical, also because there is the COP, biodiversity COP in COP15 in China in 2020. So perhaps we could also keep working together, and I can see some people I know in the room and with whom I've already started to do some work and prepare for that. So as I said, we are going to be hosting the G7 in France. Then there is the UNSG Climate Summit in September this year, and then we are hosting in France the International Congress for Nature, the IUCN Congress in June 2020, and then there is the COP15. So I think that gives us momentum, and I think we should use every single meeting to really bring and put forward some key key negotiations, but also because we believe in France, one of the things that we should do and really achieve when it comes to biodiversity and the COP15 in China is using the same methodology or approach that we use for the COP21 and the Paris Agreement, with sort of NDCs that every country report on and rather clear indicators and ways of monitoring progress of countries and keeping everybody accountable. And so we believe that we should be doing the same for biodiversity. Now the issue is what indicator, what do we choose? Then that's what we need to work on. And I know there's been a lot of thinking going on, but I think now is the time to really bring everything together and mobilize.
Yeah. To speak in support of what they've both said there. First of all, MPA, as marine protected area, is absolutely essential for our ecosystem. We have all agreed, 193 countries have agreed under SDG 14 that by next year, that 10% of the ocean will be covered by marine protected areas. We've all agreed to that. It's one of the few rays of good news at the moment is that we're trending towards achieving that. When we held the Ocean Conference in 2017, we were at 5.7%. We're now at about 7.5%. I use the UNEP figures, which is, I think, the authoritative one. And UNEP is very confident that under current commitments, we're going to get to that 10% by next year. Now, of course, there'll be those of you in the audience thinking, yeah, but what is that 10%? How well governed is it, etc.? Are they paper parks and all that? Quite frankly, I don't care. I want that 10% next year. I want to be able to tick and say the system is working. What are we going to do, though, when we get there next year? And by the way, that'll be at a second UN conference in Lisbon, first week of June. It's not yet mandated by the United Nations, but it's going to happen. We forced the first one, we're going to force the second one. And it's proceeding very well, and I expect during February we'll get the mandate for that. So when we get to Lisbon, that's when we say, these things have got to be better governed. And by the way, 10% is obviously not enough. We have to get to 30%. So where do we go with that? You just mentioned very precisely the various conferences. Now that is one of the conversations, along with Coral, which is being led by Prince Albert and Monaco and Australia and Indonesia. That is one of the conversations that has to go all the way through all those conferences you just talked about there. And I'm sure when we're in Lisbon, we're going to say 10%, we've got to go to 30%. Come on, by 2030. And I'm sure that's what they'll say at the IUCN conference in Marseille. And when we get to Beijing at the biodiversity conference, that's where we'll put it in. And we'll say, bang, 30%, that's where we've got to be. And everybody's agreed on that. Because when we get to 30%, then we'll have a viable marine ecosystem for the ocean where, fish stocks can recover. And
So agreement is critical. Writing laws, whether they're good or bad, is critical. What about enforcement?
Absolutely essential.
How does it work?
Well, the earlier panel I thought was great, talking about new technologies that can help enforce large spaces. The Global Fishing Watch was shown, which is using satellite technology to monitor these large ecosystems that have been protected currently only in national jurisdictions, because again, we don't have that law out there in the high seas. And that technology is showing that these areas, by and large, are being enforced, and actually the fishermen are adhering to those protections. Certainly much more is needed. I work with a woman who helped start Papahanaumokuakea, the first large marine protected area in Hawaii. She has me thinking about protected areas as a journey. So I point out that we're not going to be done on any one of these protected areas. It's actually going to take the life cycle of all of us engaged in these protected areas. I point out that Yellowstone, the world's first national park, has tons of problems right now. In fact, it's not open right now because the
with that,
government's
yes.
shut down. But it has, we're hunting wolves on the border. Grizzly bears were narrowly protected through litigation. We have maintenance problems with not enough money for maintenance, and we don't have enough park rangers in the park to just enforce the regulations. So it's not to say that it's not a spectacular place that I bring my family every year. It's to say that we are on a journey in all these protected places and on a journey for our planet. So yes, we need enforcement. Yes, it's going to be a challenge, but I'm very optimistic.
I could ask our panelists a number of other questions, and I will if I need to, but I'd like to turn to the audience to see if any of you here would like to ask some questions of these three. This gentleman in the front row.
David Cardemet. Curious, from a technical point of view, how you view marine protected areas in response to climate change and species shift. So one of the challenges in fisheries is who owns the fish. If you believe in property rights-based fisheries management, then that's critical. And I really don't think fisheries management has got their head around the impact of moving fish stocks, but I think equally it applies to MPA boundaries. And if you've got stranded ecosystems, corals in particular, that are rendered dead and dying from marine heat events, then I'd be interested in your views.
Who'd like to take that one up?
I'm happy to take it. So there's only really been one major paper looking at the value of these large-scale ecosystem protected areas for resilience to climate change. And it's very much based off of models. So the view is if you have an intact ecosystem, fully intact ecosystem, it is more resilient to anthropogenic forces. And that has been shown on land. And so they're actually taking the land models to the ocean, generally speaking. You're absolutely right. The whole ecosystem is projected to change substantially. I was talking to a scientist yesterday that was pointing out, well, okay, yeah, it does look like a lot of the tropical species are going to shift to the poles. But then he pointed out, well, if we actually get engaged in geoengineering and putting aerosols into the air, the projections actually change back, where the pelagics will, the equator area will actually cool, and then we will have the areas in between the poles. So it's hard to project, I think, at this point, exactly how things are going to change. My opinion is that depending on what database you're looking at, we have to get a lot more in place. We have to do our best to identify the high priority areas, and we need to start protecting them now, realizing that all these ecosystems are going to shift, the fisheries are going to shift, and we're going to have to adjust as we go. That's my take on it.
Another question here in the front row.
Yeah, a question and a brief comment, WWF. We feel that there is still a challenge in terms of embracing a new narrative around marine protected areas, because the resistance they're met everywhere, but particularly on the coastal areas where there is more activities happening, is still very fierce. We've seen on land a shift where particularly protected areas on land have been connected to economic sectors like recreation and tourism. That created a business case for actually local communities to embrace and favor protected areas. The sea still struggling, and the fishing community is still struggling to see the benefits, particularly in coastal areas. I know you're talking about ICs, but I guess ICs to some extent is similar. So I think that narrative is so important, position it in a way that community sees as a benefit in the short term, not even in the longer term. Any reflection?
Two things there. Firstly, the fishing community is no longer a fishing community when there's no fish left. Right? And you can go to places like Senegal to see that in practice. Hundreds of beautiful boats lined up on the beach, no fish out there. So what does the fishing community do? They go into people smuggling, and they themselves told me that they shoot up to Spain in those high-speed fishing boats, what they used to use for fishing. So, the world is changing, and it's changing fast. So I don't think the old lobby groups that paralyzed us in the past are going to have the same interests, that were there before. So I was going to say something about your second part. The narrative. How you position the narrative, yes. Look, I think that's a big part of it, the fact that the world is changing so fast that either we do this or it's going to happen to us anyway. But I liked your comment that you made yesterday about how biodiversity has sort of dropped off because it's a difficult concept for that narrative. Biodiversity is nature. We have to start talking about nature when we're talking about biodiversity.
Not just whales, it's actually mackerels and anchovies. That's what
Sure.
it is.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
And I think Beijing, the conference the minister mentioned, is the place to change that narrative.
Yes.
Brune, could you pick up on that question? I mean, thinking about it in the French context, how do you get people, industries, interested in the thriving high seas when it's out of sight, out of mind for most?
So it's extremely difficult, I have to say, and I've actually been struggling with that. So I'm glad you raised the question. First of all, we should stop talking about biodiversity and even ecology. The word, I don't know what it means. People don't know what it means. Well, I know what it means, but it doesn't have any meaning. It's life. So I talk about nature, and that's what we try and do. And then I think we have to bring emotions. So, and even politicians, you have to dare talking about things such as love. It's just as simple as that. Love, life, but also service and infrastructure, which is already sort of the narrative that everybody's using. But I think that's the sort of narrative politicians need to dare taking on and carrying forward. Even heads of states, they should.
Further questions from the audience?
Hi, Nishan from Mauritius. And Peter, it's a question, this panel is about the high seas. It's a question about seabed mining. You mentioned a couple of points on seabed mining, and there's legislation looking at 2020 for commercial seabed mining. But as Brune mentioned, in parallel, there's all this legislation around biodiversity and other aspects. And when you look at seabed mining, some of the most extreme biological life has been discovered around hydrothermal vents. And all the hydrothermal vents in the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic have now been licensed for seabed mining. There's no biological protection around that. You mentioned the international...
Sorry, can you repeat that last sentence?
The hydrothermal vents around the mid-Atlantic ridge and the Indian Ocean ridge, they've all been licensed now for seabed mining for...
No. There is no license for seabed mining.
For exploration.
Exploration, okay.
And so my question is about a moratorium on commercial seabed mining for the next 5 years. And I wonder, as Bruno mentioned, there's a series of conferences that are emerging. Surely the most responsible position, rather than accelerating commercial seabed mining, is to wait 5 years until we have the frameworks of biodiversity, we have a buy-in to understand science before we look at commercial seabed mining. So is that something that the UN should be considering, particularly for the Seabed Authority, where only 40 or 50 countries turn up to vote in seabed mining, not the 180 that's part of the UN system?
Okay, it's a difficult one for me to speak on because I have my personal opinion and there is a United Nations situation. First of all, I was president of the Seabed Authority for 2 years, actually, so I'm familiar with what's going on there. And as I say, we're very close to having a mining code. And whenever I speak on this, I say to the environmental community, and I commend Pew for always being there, IUCN's always there, WWF's often down there. I used to go to Jamaica for 2 weeks every year just for this. Here's the really important idea. There is a UN decade for ocean science, which has been agreed to by 193 countries of this world in the General Assembly in December 2017. And that decade will run from 21 through to 2030. Now, Nishan, I give it to you. It's not me to say it because I can't say it. But why wouldn't we give that decade its full run before we start even thinking about disturbing the seabed of the high seas? Right? So we're talking a moratorium for 10 years in that case, not 5 years. Right? That is not my idea. Right? It's Nishan's idea.
I have a question for the panel. Companies are the world's largest non-state actors. There are companies that are larger than countries. How do we make them part of this discussion? How do you get CEOs to care? And which industries in the context of the high seas are most desperately in need of reform? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just thinking about where Nishan's going to go with that moratorium and how I can help him. But sorry, can you repeat the question?
What role should companies play in this conversation? How do you get CEOs to care, and which industries in the context of the high seas are most desperately in need of reform?
Okay, well, look, companies obviously need to get involved in this because every company is looking to a sustainable future. So I'll give you, for an example, the shipping industry. Who's leading this charge at the IMO on decarbonizing the shipping industry? It's Maersk and companies like that who are taking the lead. I mean, the governments can do so much, but obviously the corporations and companies can. With seabed mining, who's leading the charge on going to seabed mining? It's Lockheed Martin and it's the Belgian consortium and so on, right? The commercial interests are what are driving these exploitations and the changes. So I think it's application of the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is not some airy-fairy UN thing. This is humanity's recipe for survival on this planet, Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. So by embracing that concept of sustainability, and I have to say that corporation boards are probably, along with governments, planning departments, are the strongest areas of uptake on SDGs. They understand that they have to make their business sustainable or they get Kodak'd.
Go ahead.
Eric, just, Peter touched on shipping, the fishing industry as well. They're industries, especially in the high seas. To Marco's point, we actually have to start to integrate fishing with protected areas. They should not be separated. They actually need to be integrated. So I think the fishing industry plays a significant role in all of this and engaging, because if you're going to be sustainable, you're going to actually have to embrace this concept as well. In addition, we also still have a problem with harmful fishing subsidies. We also need to get at that, because that creates a paradigm that actually makes overfishing profitable.
Brune, how much? Go ahead.
So, no, I was just going to say, I think we should use the decade for ocean science also as a way of informing decision-making within companies and of companies, because a lot of the time they're not fully aware of the benefits that the oceans bring. Because you're talking about the shipping companies and companies that directly work with the ocean or on the ocean, but a lot of other companies have a linked direct or indirect. So I think we should develop science and knowledge on that and share it with private companies, and then also developing innovative business models. So how sometimes, I'm not saying that the sea should be exploited or the ocean, not at all, but I'm just thinking of the services that the ocean is actually providing to private companies and how they can also benefit from that, and how it's in their interest to, which is more or less what you've just said, but it's in their interest to actually protect the ocean, because it's what they invest now is what they won't have to invest in the future, and I think they could get that.
Would you say you've had success thus far engaging French industry on these topics?
So it's very slow. So I'm thinking it's very slow. It's not up to what we would need. Clearly not. We've been putting a lot of pressure on our shipping companies to actually shift to LNG and then but that's a slightly different issue. It's more, but no, it's not enough. Again, I think that the issue is that it's governance of the ocean in France. It's fragmented, so it doesn't belong to anybody.
Running out of time now.
We're running out of time. So are we run out of time, or do we have time?
Run out of time.
We're run out of time. So.
Thank Erik,
I'm not
please.
sure. Yes, listen, let me thank the panelists, if I may. We'll wrap it up very quickly. A distinguished panel, a great conversation. I hope you leave enriched, informed, and ready to do something about the matters that were discussed on stage. Thank you.